Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Very good afternoon. Former football coach Barry Bennell has been convicted of raping and abusing young players after grooming them with claims that he could fulfil their dreams of a career in the sport. The 64-year-old has been found guilty of 36 counts at Liverpool Crown Court this morning. Sky's Enda Brady is there for us. Enda, sum up these charges.
Well, the jury came back into court just after 3 p.m. this afternoon. Barry Bennell is appearing via a video link in a prison where he is ill. He has not physically appeared in court here. He has chosen not to give any evidence in his defence, as was his right. Now, there are a total of 11 complainants, and the charges span from 1979 to 1990. And the foreman of the jury returned guilty verdict after guilty verdict, 36 in total. Now, there are still 7 counts outstanding, so the judge has now sent the jury home for the evening. They will come back to Liverpool Crown Court tomorrow for what will be day 5 of jury deliberations. At 10:15 tomorrow morning, the jury will resume its deliberations on those 7 outstanding charges. Now, Barry Bennell showed no emotion whatsoever as those verdicts came back against him, all of which this afternoon have been guilty so far, 36 in total. He stared at the floor. The court can see him. He is following proceedings via a video link, and he just stared at the floor as guilty verdict after guilty verdict came back against him. Now, some of the victims connected to those particular counts were in court, sitting in the public gallery. Some of the men wept. They were all extremely talented young schoolboy footballers in the 1980s. Some of them went on to play at underage level for England. Some of them made professional careers in the game, playing for big clubs. Bennell was a scout for Manchester City. He also coached at Crewe Alexandra FC. And the prosecution case was that Barry Bennell was a child molester on an industrial scale. That is the phrase that the prosecution had used. Mr. Bennell did not give evidence in his defence, and the defence case was that these men were publicity seekers or compensation chasers who had come forward after reading accounts about Mr. Bennell in the media. So the jury has now gone home for the evening. They will resume their deliberations on those outstanding counts at 10:15 tomorrow.
And I know you mentioned the fact that some of the victims' reaction in court, reading that when some of those verdicts were read out, there were tears in court as well. Was there a sense of justice being served for the victims who were in court there today?
Well, it has been harrowing for these men to attend court every single day, as many of them have. They haven't seen each other since they were children. And we can speak about the counts for which Barry Bennell has now been found guilty, but they all knew each other as children. They played football in the northwest of England, and they dreamed of careers in the professional game. And they were spotted and scouted in various different leagues and clubs across the northwest of England. Extremely talented players. They dreamed of becoming professional footballers, and some of them did. But they had the misfortune, the prosecution had said, to encounter a coach like Barry Bennell, who the prosecution had argued was a child molester on an industrial scale. And under the pretext of resting the boys and being ready for games on a Saturday and Sunday, he would engineer it so that they would stay at his house in Derbyshire on the border with Cheshire, where he had computer games, arcade games, takeaway pizzas, and huge amounts of football kit and boots. And he would effectively groom the children and their families before abusing the boys. That's relating to the counts for which he has today been found guilty. So the jury has gone home for the evening, and they will resume their deliberations at 10:15 tomorrow.
Enda, thank you.
Former football coach Barry Bennell has been found guilty of multiple sex offences against young boys in the 1980s. Bennell, who's 64, had denied 48 charges, including indecent assault and serious sexual assaults. But the jury convicted him on 36 counts and has asked for more time to consider 7 others. During the trial, prosecutors described him as a predatory paedophile who molested young boys on an industrial scale. Well, Danny Savage is at Liverpool Crown Court for us this evening. Danny.
Clive, this was a trial which lasted for 5 weeks. The jury went out last Thursday and returned this afternoon with some, but not all of their verdicts. And as those guilty verdicts were read out, Barry Bennell, the charismatic football coach who used his position to molest young boys, shook his head and muttered, while his victims sat in court watching on. Barry Bennell, a football coach who abused many young boys in his charge. Today he was convicted of sexually assaulting boys aged between 8 and 15. He was the gatekeeper to a dream world in football, but his victims had to silently suffer horrific abuse. His trial heard he was a child molester on an industrial scale. This afternoon he was found guilty of assaulting 10 of the 11 boys this trial centred on. The jury haven't yet reached a decision on a number of other charges and will continue their deliberations tomorrow. He abused the boys at his homes, one of which was in this Derbyshire village. He had arcade games and exotic pets and always had a reason for them to stay over. His victims were associated with Crewe and Manchester City, where he was involved in the junior setups. He was said to have been treated like God at Manchester City's main road ground. In court, it was said Bennell had groomed the parents of the complainants so he could carry on the abuse. He offered no evidence in his defence, but his barrister accused some of the men, who were boys at the time, of inventing stories about him and jumping on the bandwagon. Today, the 64-year-old, who has appeared throughout the case via video link, shook his head as the guilty verdicts were returned. Some of his victims were in tears, hearing finally that the man who abused them when they were little boys has been convicted. And as you can see from those pictures, Barry Bennell is a shadow of his former self, of what he was like to those young boys from 1979 through the 80s. There are still 7 charges against him outstanding. So the jury will return tomorrow to continue their deliberations. And the judge has told them that he will accept now a majority verdict from them with those charges going forward. So this case isn't finished yet. The jury will return tomorrow.
OK, Danny, many thanks for that. Danny Savage live there at Liverpool Crown Court.
Paedophile football coach Barry Bennell was today found guilty of a string of sex assaults on young boys. His crimes date back to 1979 and throughout the 1980s, when Bennell was working with youth teams at clubs including Crewe Alexandra and Manchester City. Prosecutors described him as a predatory and devious paedophile who groomed and targeted youngsters on an industrial scale. Some of his victims were in tears as they heard the verdicts read out in court. Jurors will deliberate on further counts tomorrow. From Liverpool Crown Court, here's Martin Geisler.
For more than a decade, Barry Bennell led a dreadful double life. Respected throughout football as a youth coach and talent scout, he was also a prolific paedophile, abusing young boys on an industrial scale.
This is the first under-14s team from Crewe that's ever won it.
Some of the brightest young players in the country were placed in Bennell's care. His trial was told how he made them promises and then preyed on them, robbing them of their innocence and their dreams. This afternoon at Liverpool Crown Court, Bennell was found guilty of 36 offences, including rape, indecent assault and serious sexual assault against victims aged between 8 and 15 at the time. His offences spanned more than a decade, from 1979 to 1990. A scout for Manchester City and Crewe, Bennell would use his status as a local football celebrity to lure players to stay the night in a house described as a young boy's paradise. His 4-week trial heard that he owned a video store and kept exotic pets, a monkey, and at one stage a puma. There were arcade games and spare rooms full of bunk beds, but Bennell's favourite players were told to share a bed with him. For more than a decade this went on, yet barely a word was said. The boys didn't even talk to each other, such was the grip Bennell held over them. Ill health meant Bennell appeared in court each day by video link, but he was accused of smirking as his victims gave evidence. The jury heard he has already served 3 jail terms in Britain and America on child abuse charges. For his victims in this case, today's verdict comes as a massive relief. They've been listened to at last and believed. Decades may have passed since the offences took place, But justice has finally been done.
Well, Martin, as you say, justice has finally been done. But what was the reaction in court when those verdicts were read out?
Well, there was audible and visible evidence of that relief I was talking about, Mary. Some of Bennell's victims and their families were in the courtroom. They had been specifically and deliberately placed in an area where they couldn't make eye contact with the jurors. They couldn't see the jury couldn't see them. That was at the judge's request. But when the foreman of the jury read out those guilty verdicts, there were tears and hugs from one of the victims in particular, and there were sighs, people exhaling. You could feel the tension lifting in that court. Remember, this was one case, but there were 11 accusers here, and for every one of them, this has been a very individual, very difficult, very dark, very lonely journey. From Bennell today, nothing, not a flicker, no emotion, and certainly no sign of remorse, which is pretty consistent with his demeanour throughout this whole trial.
So, Martin, what happens next then to Bennell?
Well, he's back in court tomorrow. Everybody is back in court tomorrow, Mary, because the jurors couldn't reach unanimous verdicts on 7 of the charges against Bennell today. So the judge, rather than taking majority verdicts, has asked them to come back and continue their deliberations. So first thing tomorrow, they get back into that jury room and carry on the work, trying to find total agreement on those 7 remaining charges. But on 36 counts today, Bennell convicted.
Martin Geisler in Liverpool, thank you.
The former football coach Barry Bennell has been found guilty of multiple sex offences against young footballers at a trial at Liverpool Crown Court. With some verdicts yet outstanding, during the trial, the 64-year-old was described as a child molester on an industrial scale, who would not just groom his victims, but also their families. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel has this report.
Today, Barry Bennell was convicted on 36 counts of abusing children in his role as a football coach. Broken down, the guilty sheet is made up of 27 charges of indecent assault, 7 of buggery and 2 of attempted buggery. His child victims number 10 in total. The abuse took place over 11 years between 1979 and 1990. During the trial at Liverpool Crown Court, Bennell was described as a child molester on an industrial scale. The prosecution said he would not just groom victims, but their families too. He was regarded, the jury was told, as a godlike figure when he coached at Manchester City's Main Road ground. His targets were boys, aged from 8 to 15, who played for City's youth teams and Crewe Alexandra. Boys described in court who dreamed of becoming professional footballers. The abuse, the prosecution said, would take place in Bennell's homes, where there were the added attractions of arcade machines, a pet monkey and a puma. Bennell, now 64 years old, declined to go into the witness box. He's denied all 48 allegations. The judge has already directed the jury to find him not guilty on 3 charges. His defence in court has described Bennell as a sitting target because of 3 previous convictions for child abuse, and that his accusers were jumping on the bandwagon. The jury will tomorrow return to court to carry on deliberating the remaining 7 charges, 4 of which relate to one alleged victim during a period when he was aged 11 to 14 years old.
Simon Israel.
Children will be